Are you a person concerned about the racist tendencies and the segregation that we have in our society today? If so, this program is for you. Welcome. Welcome to Wordnet Productions. I'm so happy to introduce to you Father Daniel Horan, OFM, PhD, a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and the director of the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's College, Notre Dame, Indiana. Father Daniel, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I think we should shake hands.
Absolutely. It's so good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I was so thrilled, overwhelmed when I saw your bio. I said, oh my God, he's ordained in 2012, and within such short span of time, he has been able to achieve such a great, magnanimous, kind of work and achievements. So, how could you do that?
That's the number one question I get.
And you look so young.
Well, that runs in the family.
Okay.
I look younger than I am, and as I like to say, I'm not getting any younger. But thank you for your kind words. The way that people usually phrase it is they ask, do you ever get to sleep?
I was going to ask you the same thing. Not only to sleep, do you ever have a free time to yourself?
I do, and I find that to be very important. So, how do I get this? How do I do what I do? I mean, part of it is my love of the work. As I think of myself and my vocation as really in three parts of almost like a pie or a pizza or something. You divide it into three. 1/3 is sacramental pastoral ministry. I've been a friar for almost 18 years, and so that's a huge part of my life and my calling. But then there's the academic side of things, my teaching, the research, the writing, the things that you've talked about in my CV. And then another part of that is outreach to general audiences. I think the ministry that you do here through the internet and through your recordings and programs, that speaks to my own experience being here in Anaheim, talking to folks in parishes and doing parish workshops and retreats. That kind of work is really important, so that it's not just working in the academy, as good as that is, education is important. Not just working in the parish or doing pastoral ministry, that's super important. But how do we reach other people in a broad way? So that's what motivates me, that's what guides me.
You speak about your motivation. What also led you to priesthood?
That's a really, really good question. I like to say I discovered my vocation in reverse. And
how could you do that? I've heard of this reverse mechanism and all that kind of thing. How did you find your vocation in reverse?
So, as a Franciscan friar, I understand myself having two vocations that are related but distinct. And this is something one of your brothers and I have worked on over the years. Father Steve Bevins, a great theologian.
Yes.
He and I have worked on the theology of religious priesthood, and that's one of my areas of research. And so when I say reverse, I mean, as a young man, as somebody in high school, I felt drawn to pastoral ministry, to sacramental ministry. But as a kid, I only knew diocesan priests. And so I had a sense in my heart God was calling me to minister to God's people in this way. But the only model was diocesan priesthood. I went off to university. It happened to be a Franciscan university called St. Bonaventure in New York State. And I met the Franciscans there. And when I grew to understand the spiritual tradition, the history, the legacy, the theology and philosophy of the Franciscan tradition going back to the Middle Ages, as St. Augustine would say, my heart was on fire, And when I say reverse, I mean my fundamental identity is as a brother in the Franciscan tradition, in the same spirit as other mendicant traditions like the Dominicans. I know Sister Jean, who works in your ministry, is a Dominican sister. And the Franciscans too, we were founded at the same time to be brothers to all of our brothers and sisters, to live in community, to embrace this spiritual tradition of gospel simplicity. And to me, that came first. Therefore, I happen to be I'm a Franciscan who happens to also be called to ordained ministry.
Ordained ministry. So that's the reason why you call it a reverse
Exactly,
process. Okay.
exactly.
Now, speaking about this reverse process, when I was reading about you, I found that you are also a co-host on a program called the Francis Effect.
Yes, yes.
Is that something to do with Pope Francis
It's
or Saint Francis?
which Saint Francis?
I don't know. You need to tell us now.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So your question is exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. My co-host and I, so I have two co-hosts now. It's Dr. David Dalt and Heidi Schlumpf. Heidi is the executive editor of National Catholic Reporter, and David Dalt is also a theologian and a professor. And it was originally his idea about 6 or 7 years ago. He said, let's have a program about an hour long, a podcast. You know?
Yeah, it's a podcast.
And I'd like to give him credit for it because it was his idea first. He said, let's have a conversation about the church today in the era of Pope Francis's ministry. But he said, and his genuine interest as a lay theologian was, here's this colleague of mine, this friend who's a Franciscan. I don't know much about religious life, so I want to know what the effect of Saint Francis has been on you too. So it was both, really. It's both and. Very Catholic,
Yes,
both
yes,
and. And so we get our inspiration for the subject matter, for the theme, from Saint Francis and Pope Francis. But our real interest there is to talk about how faith informs the way we understand the world, politics, culture, entertainment, social events, things that are happening today and affecting men and women of faith, or people who maybe are searching, aren't people of faith yet, and to kind of reflect on that from our perspective as Catholics.
Thank you. You have, as I think, correct me, you have written, I think, 16 or 70 books so far.
Not that many yet, 14.
14.
At least as last I count.
Well, you're going to be completing the 17 very soon because you have a few books right in the process, right?
Maybe
because
someday
I saw that.
Yes, that's true.
But I like to definitely today concentrate on two of the books that you have written recently, two of your recent books, but primarily the book called A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege.
Yes.
First of all, I know this is a very relevant and timely book. I think our country, so also I think in the whole world, there's a great, there's a rising tendency of what we call the racist tendency. Is that the reason why you wrote, or why did you write this? What inspired you, first of all, to write such a book? Before we get into the details of the book.
I love this question, Father. I think I appreciate it so much because it has, for me, a very long kind of pre-story, as it were, or preface. For the last 8 or 9 years, I have found myself both in teaching and in public events, being invited to give workshops and lectures, and even in my writing as a columnist, first for the Jesuit publication America magazine and now for NCR, I'd find myself writing a lot about the reality of racism in the world and in the church. And then the events, certainly post-pandemic, the horrific murders of people like George Floyd in Minneapolis and other folks elsewhere, there was a surge in attention to, what resources are available, how can we have conversations about what you just said, this rising tendency globally of racism. And who's also talked about this is Pope Francis.
Of course, yes.
He talks about what he calls the virus of racism. It keeps reappearing, it hides and then comes back, it hides, it reappears. And so the book came about because my editor at Ave Maria Press reached out to me and said, you've given these talks, you speak about this, you're passionate about the work of racial justice and how faith informs that. Would you ever write a book? And I took a long time, actually, a while to reflect, to pray, to discern, and to have conversations with colleagues, especially my colleagues of color, black professors, anti-racist activists, folks who I trusted to be honest with me about, is this a good idea? And the thing I heard over and over and over again was, there isn't enough work being done in predominantly white communities. The conversation among white folks only happens when they encounter a tragedy like the world coming to see the tape of Mr. Floyd's murder. And so the encouragement was, what if, especially in the American Catholic Church, you focused your attention on folks who look like you. In the U.S., I'm identified as a white man. I have all the benefits and privileges that come with that, unearned, unsolicited. And because of that, white folks like me don't often find themselves really forced or confronted with facing these questions. So that's the real inspiration. That was the cause. And I said I would do this.
I think to a certain extent, my next question is answered, but still I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
I was just wondering, why did you specifically call this, have the title, The White Catholic's Guide? Why not Black Catholics? I don't know, am I brown or what color? Brown Catholics?
Yeah.
And because the reason I'm saying this is because if you look at the demography of our Catholic Church today in our country, we find it is mainly a Hispanic church and an Asian church, a growing Asian church.
Yes.
The Anglo, the white per se is kind of a declining number. So what led you, what's the reason, why do you call it a White Catholic's Guide?
Well, I think you're right to say that part of it was answered a bit because, well, the first answer is we white folks don't typically have these conversations in predominantly white institutions. So that might be parishes that are mostly white. That might be schools and universities. It might be religious congregations. And it might be families, local families. So those resources haven't been as clearly made available. I was smiling a bit and thinking about when you're like, well, what color am I?
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I talk about in the book is how racial identities are constructed socially, and they vary depending on where we are in the world. In a place like South Africa or a place like Brazil, what is considered white, what is considered brown, what is considered black changes. And I always laugh too, because I'm like, I'm kind of a pinkish, kind of beige. I'm not very white myself.
The pigmentation has nothing.
Exactly. And so do we understand whiteness as something more than, both it is a reflection of skin color and the meaning that's assigned to that in society, but there's more to it as well. What's considered normative? What's considered, we talk about the United States, and it's true. We're a baby nation across the globe, frankly, but we have a very painful history that at times we U.S. citizens don't want to grapple with, white citizens in particular. And the truth is that race is something that has been constructed. Racism is part of our DNA, or as some people, including the bishops of the United States in their most recent document said, it's America's original sin, the reality of racism.
Yeah.
And so as people of faith, do we take seriously this question? What is our response to this original sin? And quite frankly, folks who are identified as anything other than white, so of Asian descent or African descent or from India or Native Americans, First Nations people, on a day in and day out basis, folks not identified as white have to confront the realities of America's racism. White folks don't. That's one of the things that's so insidious about the sin of racism. So part of what motivates me is to say, as one white man, one white religious priest, to my fellow white Catholics, let's have this conversation. Let's hear the hard truth. Let's challenge one another and not continue to ignore it, pretend it's not real.
Okay, Daniel, we are going to take a short break, and we're going to dive into this book and into this big sin of racism in the next segment. I hope you're enjoying the dialogue that we are having with Father Daniel. Please don't go away. There's much more to come.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
Welcome back. We're having this wonderful dialogue with Father Daniel, OFM. In the last segment, we spoke about one of your books, A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege. Father Daniel, I would like to ask you, what is systemic racism?
It's such a good question. Systemic racism is really the way to describe racism in general.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that, we might have to take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
When most people in the United States and other parts of the world as well think about racism, what usually comes to mind is what some scholars refer to as common sense racism. And that's basically boiled down to racially motivated harm or animus. So when somebody uses derogatory language or discriminates in the workplace or refuses service or access on account of somebody's race, that's very clearly a racist incident and a form of racism. Or if people embrace sort of white supremacist ideology, like in the US, the KKK or neo-Nazis, that's what most people think of. Systemic racism is a way of describing how racism works in a structural way. It involves institutions and laws and relationships, and that truly racism is not just one directional. It's not just about the harm caused to minoritized people on account of their racial identity. It also recognizes that there are two sides to the coin, and that just as on account of race some people are disadvantaged or harmed, other people in the same racist society are advantaged or receive certain privileges or accommodations. So systemic racism recognizes that complexity, that it's more than just single incidents of people who are, overtly bad people who hate people of different racial identities.
So that this is kind of a, program. This is totally organized against another group or people, right?
It can be. I mean,
Because,
it's part of it.
You mentioned about the language, the rhetoric. So that means it is kind of programmed, process of attacking or belittling or putting down a group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look at systemic racism, what makes that distinctive is that we're able to kind of zoom back out a little bit and see how things that might otherwise be explained to those in dominant positions of society based on race. So in the United States, folks who are identified as white occupy a dominant position, right? Racially, that is. They might be able to explain away, as it were, disadvantages or harm to other populations and not attribute that to racially based suffering or oppression. And what systemic racism says is actually it's a little bit more complicated than that. Okay. And so, for instance, you might have laws on the books, like in a country such as the US, that says, for instance, you can't go faster than 55 miles per hour on the highway. But how is the law enforced? And this becomes a very, I think, relevant issue in our own time because of the video recordings of the way law enforcement has deployed violence against certain populations more than others. And so when we look at the bigger picture, we see that it's not just one-off instances. There's a pattern. There is, if not exactly a program, then there is a kind of a system of discrimination, of oppression, of subjugation that exists in our communities.
This leads also to another question that I would like to ask you. What does it mean to be a white?
Yeah, that's a very important question.
Yeah.
Here in
But
Anaheim.
you just mentioned little, you touched upon that.
Yeah. Well, here in Anaheim, I've been talking about that in my workshops. For folks like me who are identified as white, we rarely ask ourselves, what does it mean to be white? And part of the answer is, in a systemically racist society, whiteness is presumed to be normative, to be the default, to be, superior. And that's what that term white supremacy means. A lot of people associate that, understandably, with people who have overtly racist ideologies. That's certainly true. They say that's a white supremacist ideology. And yet, any community, any society that values whiteness as superior or supreme is a white supremacist society. So whites, by and large, have not had to ask themselves, what is my racial identity? For so much, and I'll speak from my own experience, no one sat me down and said, you don't have a racial identity. But the way that a systemically racist society sort of operates is, I'm reared and educated and entertained even by television and movies, certainly not this channel, of course, but in other ways, that racial identity and race is something other than whiteness. So those, from India have a race, but a white person in the United States doesn't. Or people of African descent in the US have a race, but white people don't. And one of the things I address in the book, as you name, is to acknowledge that all of us have racialized identities, and that race is a social construct.
Yeah, it is.
And we talked about this in the first segment when you asked, what color is my skin? It depends what society you're in. In South Africa, you may be labeled one thing, in the United States labeled another, in various parts of India, it may vary as well.
Well, yeah, that's right. The racism here, of course, I think we are going from color.
Yes.
There are other countries, other societies, other culture, where they would approach it from not from color of your skin, but because of the birth or the tribe that you belong to. Because I think in one of your books, I don't think we will have enough time to get into that, the contemporary theological anthropology. I'm sure you might be speaking about that as well. But now you spoke about what does it mean to be a white. Now the same question can be asked by the other group as well. Like, what does it mean to be a black, or what does it mean to be a brown?
Yeah.
And they also have the same problem. Now, one of the major, I think, aspect is I think, touched upon with regard to the privilege of being a white.
Yes.
Does it mean that the rest are on the periphery, margin, or are being exploited?
Oftentimes, right? So I think you name a really important point, that the identity of whiteness, so racial identity, or an understanding of somebody's identity being in part labeled with how one's phenotype or appearance, skin color, that's one thing. And in and of itself, it's somewhat neutral. It's when we apply meaning and value to one's skin color. So to be a white person in a racist society means that you have certain advantages, certain privileges. A lot of white folks who are, for instance, economically disadvantaged, maybe they experience poverty or homelessness, they might say, well, I'm white, but I can barely make ends meet. I can't provide for my family. Where is my, quote, privilege? I hear that, and I say, well, maybe privilege is not the best way to think about it. Maybe what it means to be white in a racist society is that there are obstacles that you don't have to encounter, challenges and burdens that you don't have to face, that you can be blissfully ignorant about. Whereas people who are not white encounter this on a daily basis, sometimes to great personal threat and danger. And meanwhile, white folks are not even aware. And I think that's what we mean when we talk about privilege.
Having spoken all this as two priests, both of us, as believers, as Catholics, what can we do? What can we do to counter these racist tendencies, segregation in our society?
Such an important question, because I think too often Catholics on this subject, and so many, tend to be compartmentalized. My Catholic faith is over here, my social concerns are over here, my family is over here. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. And what I encourage people to think about is how consistent we should be about our faith. So that concern around racial justice, overcoming racism and white supremacy in our communities and in our church and in our world, this isn't an add-on. This isn't something we do in addition to our faith. I like to say it's what we do because of our faith. So what can believers do? The first thing is the church has a lot of teaching, magisterial teaching, teaching at the local bishop's level, both in the United States, but also there are wonderful documents by the bishops' conferences of the United Kingdom, of the South African bishops, of the bishops of India, who have all written about the reality of systemic racism, the reality of this sort of discrimination, and what, as people of faith, we can do. Pope Francis, very recently in Fratelli Tutti in 2020, talks about racism as a virus that is always present. He calls it the pandemic of racism at times. And so many other popes have talked about this as well. I mention that because I want our viewers, especially viewers of Catholic faith, to know that this is not an add-on. It's not really even an option. It's part of our faith tradition. Yeah. The church teaches racism is a social evil. And like other evils in our world, we have a responsibility to respond. The last thing I might say just on that about Catholic identity is we have the language for this. It's built into our tradition. So we all recognize that we're affected by the consequences of original sin. All of us. It's a shared experience. Likewise, we have a shared experience of racial injustice in our communities and in our world. The question isn't, does it exist? The question is, how do we respond to it? And I think as people of faith, we have that language of structural sin, of original sin, and it should call us to do something.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. I definitely agree, because it's the same spirit.
Yes.
It's the same spirit that led Christ. It's the same spirit that led the apostles, and down the centuries, many believers and the innumerable number of saints that have remained and that remains continuously for as examples are the ones who are leading us too. And it's the same spirit that is in the white-skinned person and the black, or whatever color is, whatever race, whatever tribe. So we should definitely be living the gospel values and building a society where everybody has equal value and place. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your life, sharing your ideas, and especially this wonderful aspect of living our Christian life through this book.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this dialogue with Father Daniel. Please, as we both shared, we all belong to one God, and we are His children. Let's live as that one, the children of that one God, always. Be blessed. Take care.